at this event when it comes to actually anything about France, and certainly the least well read. So I've been scribbling all of my notes every time you mention some key text that I have not yet read. I'm doing this. So I hope that it makes sense what I'm going to present today, but essentially this is the beginning of a project, and in bold and unapologetic American style, I'm here to network and make relationships and develop partnerships. So if something looks interesting and I could be useful to your project, then let me know. And if you say something that's interesting, I promise you I'm going to come and try to recruit you to my evil ways. So like I said, I'm a scholar of the American suburbs, in particular of the foreclosure crisis and the transformation of the American suburbs, issues like the suburbanization of poverty and new geographies of race and class, because the American suburb is fundamentally transformed. But one of the things that I think is particularly important about the American suburb and American suburban studies that is useful here is that the discovery of poverty in the contemporary suburbs coincides with a movement amongst historians to sort of rediscover already existing poverty that was always there. So in some ways I think part of the Banlieue project is not just sort of reimagining what the Banlieue is, but a recognition that this involves somewhat of a reimagination of what the Banlieue always was. That it's never been the way that it has been described in its totality. It's never been exclusively about either the grand ensembles or the, this in no more represents, I would argue, the sort of true reality of the full banlieue than this does of the spaces outside the American city. And that's true whether you adopt, again, the sort of the grand ensembles of a certain era or the newer versions in the Ville Nouvelles. So in some ways, the call for this, and when I saw the call for this conference, I realized that there's a group of people who are sort of approaching things very similarly in some ways to what American suburban scholarship is going. It's both a kind of a deeper investigation of both the differentiation that is occurring now, along with a similar kind of historical project of trying to reimagine the past a little bit. In particular, I'm imagining what drives me, though, forward is that ultimately, though I do have a degree in history, I'm not a historian, I'm a planner, and what fundamentally interests me in both the American and the French case are the ways in which we are intervening in the future of these spaces which are home to the majority of citizens of the nation, right? Not just the majority of the citizens of the region. The majority of French people live in this area outside of the central city. They're not rural residents, they're not city center residents. France has a suburban majority, as does the United States, and the question is, what is the future of this space? So, like I said, the other aspect of me is that again, on the one hand I'm a suburbanist, on the other hand I'm a regionalist. And so again, my definition of the banlieue is really simple. It's all of the area that is not inside the périphérique. It doesn't fetishize one particular space over the other, the blank spaces, the non-blank spaces, the grand ensembles, anything. Now this might be in contrast to sort of the way the connotations of the word are both academically and non-academically. I'm okay with that because the banlieue is actually the only word to really sort of describe the larger space, I think, well, whereas we have words like cité and grand ensemble and ville nouvelle and Zax and all these other sort of smaller words to describe the specific spaces. But how do we think about the larger area that is the Paris Basin, especially the areas that are outside? Now, within kind of regional studies, we have really problematic approaches as well. So this is a German study of France, and so I'm highlighting, I'm sorry for the bad graphics, but it's a terrible map anyway. The areas that you see, it should be familiar to you, this area. What that means in the map is social and economic problem area. So that's literally all of this. Right? So this is the same, in regional studies, you still get this same kind of undifferentiated approach where you sort of map and demarcate entire swaths of territory as problems in themselves. Not places that have problems within them, but this is a problem area, and therefore everybody within it becomes a problem. So how to begin this project? So this is where, in some ways, I really enjoyed the talk earlier, is that there was a recognition that I couldn't understand or begin a project in the French banlieue in the Paris banlieue unless I understood more about the banlieue. And so sort of I like to think of it as a sort of Marseille-era Walter Benjamin approach is simply to get about. And one of the problems, I think, with Desartaux and a lot of French theorists has been a fetishization of walking as a form of mobility. I mean, it's a wonderful thing, but it's a very 19th century thing. I'm sorry, the Banlieue is just far too big. You kind of can't get anywhere on foot. Even if you're going off the RER, you need some sort of other mode of transportation. Even though now I'm a southerner, and of course, you know, southerners like their Banlieue, in Paris that really wasn't very practical. So we went with the old Trek 1000 souped up and the Paris and Banlieue pratique. So it's not Paris inside Banlieue. I thought I had to check that. I was like, is my indispensable have problematic politics? But in fact, maybe they've changed it. I like the idea of the Paris and Banlieue pratique. That somehow, you know, this is a revolution. And so this is what I've done thus far. So the map in red, the red lines are routes that I've taken where my GPS was actually functioning and I was able, so that's actually a fairly accurate rendition. I filled it in with purple bits where my GPS stopped working or I forgot to turn it on. Not a brilliant quantitative researcher. But this has been my attempt right now, and essentially to kind of try to understand what is this space outside of Paris. How do all these pieces fit together? Again, recognizing that I needed to just be able to fit, which is what regionalists have been really terrible at doing, of fitting the grand ensemble, the cités, into the larger fabric of what is Grand Paris. How do all these places fit together? And again, most importantly, how are they changing? That's what ultimately interests me. So this is the route right now that I did. 90% of it was between April and June of last year. It's somewhere between 500 and 750 kilometers, something like that. I've now been to, I think, 36 of the 40 different communes in the Neuf-Trois, and I'd say roughly 60% of the Quatre-Vingt-Douze, and maybe about 40% of the Quatre-Vingt-Quatorze, and then little bits of, you know, the 78, etc., etc. So the way I like to think about it theoretically is in some ways actually to deny Michel Desartaux's sort of dichotomy between the migrational city and the panoramic city. And the argument that if you do enough migration, you can actually build your own panorama. And then not only that, if you do your migration with a topo map, you can actually discover these sort of new panoramas. I mean, one of the things that makes Paris such a difficult and fascinating and interesting city is that as a San Franciscan, it's really frustrating because you can't actually find any one point where you can actually see the whole thing. It's impossible. I'm used to these places where, again, you know, either from the top of the World Trade Center or you know, back in the day, or the top of the Empire State Building, or from the top of any number of hills in the San Francisco Bay Area, you can sort of see the majority. That is impossible in Paris. But there are all of these vantage points where you can see a whole lot of it, and if you again, move around a lot, you'll find these little corners like Argenteuil where you see some really fascinating things. So very quickly, and I want to get you to the sort of, this is what my kind of 3 major research projects are, and then hopefully a provocation at the end along the line of comparison. Again, you know, I'm going to try to think and write a little bit within the French context initially, but the ultimate goal is a comparative project. So one of the things that I'm fascinated about is the discovery of lots of really fascinating public spaces and parks that you wouldn't necessarily imagine. They're in some ways the dream parks that I find missing inside of Paris. This is Chantereine, it's in Gennevilliers, it's in many, many cities, in between the Neuf-Deux and the Neuf-Trois. You know, you'd expect to see these kind of bourgeois spaces, but part of my goal was, again, to spend enough time in the west of Paris in these old traditional bourgeois spaces to see how they fit. You know, Maison Lafitte is a very, very bizarre city. You know, this isn't, you know, hipster in, you know, urban agriculture, right? One of the things, I think this was mentioned earlier about how the urban France still really reaches into large parts of the area. So this is not very far from Sarcelles and Villiers-le-Bel. You still get these areas where agriculture is still poking in to the city. The pavillon, you know, my original, you know, knowledge of the pavillon didn't appreciate sort of how physically integrated so many pavillon communities are, and I think this is the relationship between them is something that I don't think, at least in the English language treatments of the Banlieue, is fully appreciate just how important they are. And this is one of the areas where I've been reading a lot because I've been involved in a project that is looking at the densification of Banlieue communities. Project BIMBI, which is a very kind of controversial project, but that's been one of my sort of formal entrees into French research. There's also kind of, I think, that we don't imagine that auto-dominated, freeway-dominated metropolis, but Paris, you know, fundamentally had huge portions of it that were remade by the auto. Now we know, you know, it never rebuilt the center of Paris like was once imagined in some of those famous pictures from the early 1960s and late 1950s. But the car-oriented spaces and the freeways really fundamentally do dominate in a way that, again, in my own imagination, wasn't central. Part of it has been a sort of an attempt to find as well the mundane spaces, right? Not incredibly bourgeois, not incredibly, you know, not the famous cités. I like to think, and this is my like a bad attempt at Raymond Depardon, but these spaces fundamentally exist throughout the banlieue. Again, that are neither the banlieue, that are neither, you know, it's not Neuilly, it's not the city of 4000, it's not even, you know, mundane, boring banlieue moche of the pavillon. It's just sort of France, I guess. I don't know how else to describe this other than that's France, and you don't know that that's a small, well, I think this is somewhere in the Neuf-Cat, right near, you know, not too far from the city. There's just so many kind of unknown, just exceptionally French places that were in their core. There'll be one area, and then on the fringes you'll have cités or you'll have new towers. You know, some of my favorite spaces are, again, the real minority spaces. This is the self-built banlieue, which exists. This is in Argenteuil. I think this is a lot, my unsophisticated guess is that this is a lot of places where builders, people who made their money building houses in France, in Paris, come to build their own houses. I expected to see the remnants of de Gaulle in a certain area, but some things that were surprising were, for instance, the location of a memorial against slavery right around the corner from the Holocaust Memorial in Drancy, as if this is sort of a symbolic of the state trying to, I don't know, put all of its bad shit in Drancy. I'm expecting them to move the Saint-Michel Bridge in 1961 there too, and just say, okay, Drancy is where we put all of our memorials to all of the bad things that we've done. So you get these really sort of strange symbolic issues that come about. This is the subject of work by colleagues like Marie-Flo Albecker and others that I think, again, doesn't necessarily get connected to some of the work on the Grands Ensembles and the Cités, which is essentially the redevelopment of the building of essentially a lot of small little La Défenses all throughout the city. This is Microsoft headquarters in EC. Saint-Denis will soon have more office space than La Défense. Right? So we're creating, it's now a truly multipolar region, and again, that earlier map that I showed you is from a very literature that is very disconnected, you know, very German, Regional Studies Association, English scholars writing about the new economic spaces. It's not something that has really been integrated very well into the study of the cités. One of the things that's really important to remember is that the French state is still really involved in mass city building that is not just about redeveloping old Grand Ensembles, but about building new versions of it. So this is the 14C, which is another major project, again, built with different design models, built as a public-private partnership from the beginning, integrated social housing, roughly 20-30%, whatever, you know, which is standard, integrated within it. EC is not one of the cities that I think has fought against, it's not Neuilly, it's not Saint-Mande-des-Fosses that has pushed back against the integration, but this project still continues. So again, I will poke at you all some people who like to sort of focus on the state was there and then they weren't there, all these sort of grand changes that we like to think about. A lot of things stay the same in France, and that's actually one of the things I respect about France is that the French haven't abandoned the model of urbanism as really sort of central to the society the way we did in the United States. And you get all these also sort of bizarre integral spaces. Somebody's working on Boulogne, so I thought I knew that you were doing it, that's why I put this picture in there, which is one of the most strangely bizarre hybrid spaces that you'll find. And then of course, and you know, this is the other side, the new, in some ways sort of the thing that we're talking about as much now, are the sort of return of some of the bidonvilles, and this is actually not in Drancy, this is in Bobigny. And the spaces of the Roma, which you will find throughout the Neuf-Trois in particular. So one thing I did expect to see certain forms of kind of racial politics, what we would consider sort of kind of cultural politics. Like it's always good to see Biggie under the Bobigny Bridge. If I was a real poet, I would write a poem called Biggie under the Bobigny Bridge, or the Bondy Bridge on the border of Bobigny. But what I didn't kind of come to realize, right, is the existence of other forms of kind of racial, religious, ethnic politics from the right. For instance, in these strange little islands like Leeds, which again, in my popular imagination of the Banlieue, never even existed. The idea that something like this, where you get the Jewish Defense League, which I believe has now been accused of murder, you know, showing their face in the Leeds. I expected to find, you know, what I would consider sort of racialized class politics around the production of space in Leeds. This is fighting a particular route of the tram, of the T4 line that descends from the plateau in Clichy to connect to the various larger systems in Aulnay and in Bondy, and they don't want a certain route of it, and because it goes right through the center of town, and they don't want those people coming through this part of town. This is old urban politics. It was also not surprising to see, you know, the writing on the wall. This is a year ago. The writing on the wall in many of these communities of the sort of right-wing revanchism that we just witnessed over the last couple of weeks. But things that surprised me, and again, this is very much my American view, is the sort of lack of really any real representation. And this is, again, not surprising. So in America, you know, the mayor of Bobigny and the mayor of Clichy-sous-Bois would not look like this, and they couldn't look like this. That would be impossible. So he won, she lost. But this is the fact, is that with parachuting in, I mean, what is Clichy-sous-Bois? It can't be, it's got to be 80% people of color, and you'd never find an Olivier Klein as the mayor of a place like Clichy. It's sort of almost impossible at this point. So these are the parts that really confuse me. One of the many things that I'm hoping to work with French scholars, you can help me sort of understand parliamentary democracy for Americans is extremely important. It's like I could certainly learn Mandarin. I find it very difficult to understand. But there's an aspect to it. It's not a coincidence, for instance, that the new mayor of Bobigny, of Aulnay is a Bechiza, right? That the new mayor of Bobigny is a Di Paoli. Right? These are parts of the Italian migration. Again, you know, there was an earlier wave of immigration of Italians and Spaniards in France that have been integrated into the state in some ways, and integrated into the UNP in particular. And there's an aspect of that. All right, let me just finish up quickly so that I don't understand. So let me go to the real projects that I'm looking for help on, and then one provocation will be done. So again, everywhere you go, you see these signs of the Banlieue being redone. So the big project for me is really on this, on the role of transportation and mobility as a dominant paradigm in this. The basic idea is that if you can move people, you're never going to be able to build local labor markets in any of these communities. You have to be able to provide people access to education and jobs elsewhere. And so to what extent, what are the types of transformations? And these transformations have many kinds, from the ones in Sarcelles to, for instance, Montrouge and various other extensions of the metro line, which is sort of the gentrification express. Right? So it's very different the way it's going to be in the new Front Populaire en Aubervilliers, as, for instance, the T5, I think this is going to be, in Sarcelles. And again, some of the, I have some issues with the Grand Paris Express, but this is a radical and fundamental transformation of the banlieue, and actually one of the most interesting cases of this on a global scale. And I actually am a huge defender in some ways of French urbanism, and the fact that it is never given up on trying to innovate in the urban ways, but there's a lot of questions about what this is going to mean. So this is project number one. A much smaller project is on visualization, which is that everywhere you go you see visualizations of the new banlieue. And it's not surprising that, perhaps for people, that nobody in these pictures looks like anybody in the actual banlieue. So you get, the only exception I found was in Argenteuil, where you get this sort of multiplicity of differences. But in the same, around the corner from that picture in Argenteuil, you get the picture of the Gucci lady next to the, that's the actual real woman in the real city walking past that sign. So I took two pictures. But it must be something in laïcité that prevents women from hijab from being represented on any sort of rendering that exists. I mean, I never once, I have now probably, I have 6,000 photos that I've taken in the archive, and probably 500 of them of representations, and none of them include a woman in a hijab. So finally, I want to end with one provocation, though, which is, again, about the line between the Americans and the French, is that I would argue that in the American case, we have created this kind of cultural political space for integration in a way that can elect Obama president. In a way that Biggie is not a cultural figure of black neighborhoods. Biggie is just Biggie. He's my generation. He's as American as it gets. But that we haven't, in the French, like as in France, invested in the urban spaces so that the reproduction of inequality is fundamentally an urban phenomenon in the United States. I would argue that perhaps in France we're thinking about the inversion. That all of this investment in the disinvested spaces of the banlieue has repaired some of the physical fabric, but that the barriers to integration in the French case are in fact more cultural and political. That Obama is not possible in France, that I had to witness, like a lot of French people, Marine Le Pen sitting next to Ramayad and stumbling over her name on France 2 the other night, in a way that really realizes how far France has to come. But again, when it comes to physically intervening in the places where issues have been, France is far ahead of the United States. And so that for me is the last provocation. Real sorry for going over time, and thank you so much for having me.
Merci.